Whoa, here we go. Well, we'll wait for the tens of people to show up, Esther. Maybe we'll have as many listen to the podcast show up. All 10.
Hey, you had half a dozen people jump in right away, so
Oh.
we're waiting for you.
All right. So, like I said, literally tens of people joining us for this thing. Does that mean we're on the Facebooks as well now, or just on the YouTube? We're on the YouTubes.
So the YouTube is live and streaming for anyone who's watching directly on our website, and that's where the masses are. That's where you probably got 100 people watching. And then the chat has a dozen people in it who will also be asking questions, and it's climbing by the second. So
Whoa, you're big time, Esther. It's all for Esther. So it's Lisa.
Lisa. It's just hi, Lisa. I just saw that at the bottom.
Yeah, me too. Nice to meet you, Lisa. We've Lisa and I have known each other for all of like 7 hours or so. And look at her. She's already watching live random webcasts about things. So, Stephen, should we give people, it is now officially 7:14, which is the official start time, folks. Should we give people a couple more minutes to jump in, or should we get started, Stephen? What do you want to do?
I'll leave that totally up to you.
Oh dear. I'm not sure you want to leave things up to me, Stephen. That seems.
Oh, I have great confidence.
Oh, little danger. You. Oh. I wouldn't. So I guess we'll get started then. We might as well. Esther, you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's get started. Welcome all of you to the strangest Lyceum project of all time, without a doubt. The strangest Lyceum project of all time. It is so strange not to be able to look out at a physical building with physical humans sitting there. We normally have 600 or 700 people show up to these things. Actually, that's not really true. We have like 13 people show up to these things, but this, Esther, I think people are here. They're here to see you and listen to you say some really great things. We have, so just a quick backstory on this. Esther and I started talking about this Lyceum back in the fall, trying to figure out how this is going to go. And well, everybody knows what's happened in the last 5 weeks or so. And so my initial reaction, we were actually in a meeting, and Amy was sitting beside me. I turned to Amy, and we just sort of shrugged. What we want Esther here, but everybody's shutting down, and everybody has to stay in their house. And so I emailed Esther and said, I think we probably just need to call it. And then I realized that's a huge mistake. We can still do this thing. Esther we still got to have Esther. And by then I'd gotten to be an expert in Zoom. I'm so really good at Zoom. And the entire rest of the country now is super good at Zoom. So I emailed Esther back, and I pitched her this crazy 4-day conversation with her, and she immediately said, yes, let's do this thing. And so those of you who have been keeping score at home, Esther has joined us for the podcast. So go to the academypodcast.com and listen to Esther and I's conversation. It's so great. She talked to our high school students, blew their minds. And last night she hung out with us for way longer than she should have. And we just sort of chatted and talked about things and got to know Esther. And we're so grateful, Esther, that you are with us and have decided to join us. It's so good to have you.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad I have too. I just cherish all the little snippets of conversation that I've gotten to have. And I just pray this is a foretaste for something short of heaven.
It really has been a really nice, beautiful light in the middle of all of this weirdness and craziness.
May it be. We need it.
We definitely need it. The Academy of Classical Christian Studies is we're a classical school in Oklahoma City. Our goal is to produce students who are fully human, fully virtuous, and embody especially that great cardinal virtue of wisdom and that arch theological virtue of charity, all in to love and serve their neighbor and the common good, and the kingdom of Christ who makes all that possible. And this Lyceum project is sort of a sort of peeling back of the curtain of what goes on daily in our classrooms, pre-K to 12. This is a way for us to open that door a little bit and invite great speakers to come join us, to show our whole community. And normally it's just the Oklahoma City community, but now it turns out I've got a former colleague who's in Toronto, and he's tuning in and sent stuff around in Canada, and all of our podcast listeners in France, I'm sure, are fully tuned in. Chaz Wolfman, I'm sure, is jumped right in to um, Doug, Esther. Doug Servin is texting me right at the moment.
Hi, Doug.
And he said he's tuning in to his
Oh,
favorite
great.
professor. So we have far more people from all over the place joining
That's
us,
awesome.
Esther. And so what we want to do is sort of showcase the kind of conversations that we have with our students all the time by, again, inviting the highest quality scholars that we can meet. And when I was thinking this year about who I wanted to talk, Esther Meek was 1,000,000% at the top of the list. If you want to hear, and I know you do, you want to hear my story of meeting Esther, go to our podcast. I spend an inordinate amount of time telling that story in that podcast. So she can do the same for you, is what I've been telling people all the time while you've been here. So if you have one logistical point, and then I'm going to turn Esther loose. If you have questions, so the Q&A part of this is going to be a little quirky because we can't sort of raise our hands and do the thing we might normally do. If you want to leave a question, you can either, if you're tuning in on the webinar, there's some places to do that. And Esther, I'll tackle those. You keep doing your talk, and we'll start calling those. And then if you're on the Facebook page, the Academy's Facebook page, and if you're not on Facebook, go hurry and get yourself a profile and go to the Academy Facebook page. You can leave your questions there. Amy Allen and I will be monitoring those questions throughout. And then when Esther's talk is over, we'll cull through those and we'll get to as many as those as we can and get Esther's thoughts on your thoughts to her thoughts.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Great. Well, with that, Esther Meek, take it away.
Well, thank you, Josh Spears, and thank you to the Academy for having me. And I'm a little apologetic for the length of this talk, but I'll try to be as entertaining as I can. And I will look forward to hearing, some comments from you too. So before I begin, though, I do want to say I'm going to tell you my intellectual autobiography to this time, but I actually feel like I'm on the verge of something new and half known. And that's very fitting for covenant epistemology. I feel like I might be moving to something more like an entrepreneurial sort of a thing, some sort of a creative outreach with regard to covenant epistemology. And I'd love to invite you to have a part in that. And so if you'd like to stay in touch, and you would, you can email me through my website, which is, at the moment, it's longing to know, but it's about to go to Esther Lightcap Meek, thanks to my daughter. But you can reach me through there, and if it would be okay, I'll add you to my contact list. And I'm hoping that I can have some more frequent contact in the future, and also be evolving something together. So I'll look forward to hearing more from you too. And I wish more of that could happen tonight, but you get to, you have the dubious privilege of listening to my story tonight. But anyway, you'll be oriented by the end of it. So hopefully that will be good. And because I'm in philosophy, and Aristotle was the peripatetic philosopher, if you get sleepy, not that I'd see you anyway, but you're certainly welcome to get up and pace. But yeah, don't fall asleep. Oh, there we go. So this is titled My Quest for Reality. So this is the introduction. I'm very glad to be with you, even if only virtually. Thank you for your invitation. Please invite me again in person. Tonight, it is for the sake of our virtual connection that I choose to acquaint you with my work by telling it in story form. I hope this will be easier to engage as you listen. And if it looks like I'm reading a teleprompter, it's because I feel I am. So I'm sorry. Okay, this story is effectively my intellectual autobiography. As a quest, it is a longing to know. However, I offer it because I pose that it is your story too. Indeed, the story of most people in modernity in the West. Kindly enter in and ask yourself wherein you identify and how it is unfolding for you. Also, I hope you will see and agree that this quest is indeed worth a lifetime. It matters at the core of who we are and how we relate to the world. By modernity, I mean the milieu and culture birthed in the 1600s in the West, which continues to grow in stridency. It presumes a certain view of knowledge and a specific view of reality. These views override a fundamentally more human and attuned approach to both. Modernity exalts power, mastery, and utility. It jettisons much, beginning with philosophizing. Its philosophy is anti-philosophical. This is a contradiction, obviously. Modernity exiles also wonder and beauty. Modernity actually rejects reality itself and real things, which is why I have been on a quest for reality. Are you familiar with the word acedia? Acedia, one of the 7 deadly sins, involves a refusal to consent to being, that is, to reality. Modernity is intrinsically a posture of acedia. While much good has come of modernity, much damage has as well. This is because of its fundamental anti-philosophical orientation adverse to reality, a posture at the very heart of who we are. It plays out for good or ill through all that we do. A brief COVID-19 comment. How modern are the signature features of this bizarre and painful time? The reality of our global connection, both physically and virtually. But then the fact is that this, like Babel, falls short of making us impregnable. A lowly critter, a virus, can win. Human existence, many have thought, is best understood against the backdrop of death. Death and our very lives come from beyond us. It tends to eclipse petty quests, but it also gives hope of the real. My lifelong quest has been for contact with reality. This odd descriptor was the name of my dissertation and the title of its recent publication. It shapes the titles I give the stages of my quest here. Also, you should know that the first 6 chapters are relatively short. The 7th is the largest and last chapter of the story. Okay, the first chapter is called No Contact, or perhaps this might be better termed Lost Contact. Anyone familiar with Enneagram 4s will get this. Also, I have to say, now that I have come to embrace the profound insights of a few scholars regarding the ontological paradise of the mother's smile, I understand that life thwarts this first beatific vision and turns our lives into a quest for reality. I was born into a fundamentalist, dispensationalist Baptist home and church and grew to know the Bible with its Schofield reference notes. My parents both trained at Bible school and they taught the Bible to others. I knew all there was to know about God. Laughable, of course. But along about the 8th grade, I found myself pondering a couple unsettling questions. How do I know that God exists? And how do I know that there is a material world beyond the ideas in my mind? It seemed glaringly obvious that I was certain, but only certain, of the ideas in my mind, which essentially blocked proof of a world beyond. At the time, I thought the questions were probably sin, and I kept them to myself. I knew they were weird, but I did not have the proof that these important matters required. In high school, I followed my mother's red pencil underlinings through Francis Schaeffer's Then New, The God Who Is There. I learned, surprise, that my questions weren't sinful, they were philosophical. I also learned that responses to them over the centuries had shaped whole cultures across the disciplines. This last fired my love for things interdisciplinary. As to the first, it took a couple more years for me to find out that you could actually study philosophy. From the moment I learned this, it took under 12 hours for me to change my life course to pursue it. It seemed obvious to me that I didn't have the smarts for it, but it seemed even more obvious that I was obligated anyway, because these were the most important questions. So began my quest for reality. I transferred to study philosophy, finishing a BA and an MA in philosophy as a concentration in interdisciplinary degrees. I found that philosophy was revitalizing my faith. I came to feel that my task in life might be to help others to this as well. Ordinary people like me who maybe were believers, but who knew nothing of philosophy. That's chapter 1. Here's chapter 2. It's called Hope of Contact. So on I went, first to Westminster Seminary, since from my undergraduate professor, I had also been imbibing a reformational perspective. And then to a PhD at Temple University in my hometown of Philadelphia. Studying with Bantillion theologian John Frame, I was absorbing his account of the biblical parameters of human knowing that he was offering. It seemed responsible, but it also seemed arbitrary. At the same time, a young man at church lent me his copy of Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge. That was a moment, as it turned out. I'm not reading you footnotes. Come on. Michael Polanyi was a Hungarian scientist turned philosopher who died in 1976, a couple years before I found his work. He was a premier scientific discoverer at the beginning of the 20th century, in conversation with Albert Einstein and other science giants of the day. He was of the caliber to be given a lab to which people would come from all over the world to apprentice. Multiple Nobel Prize winners came out of Polanyi's labs, including his son, John. Discovery was his job, and he was a genius. But Michael, of course, impacted by the crises in Europe surrounding the world wars, turned to ponder how science itself works and to labor to defend the necessity of liberty for the work scientists do. In addressing these concerns, he developed his fresh, science-based philosophy of knowing propounded in the circa 1950 Gifford Lectures, which became this book I now was introduced to, Personal Knowledge. First, I had been looking for a dissertation topic, and Polanyi's work offered just what I was looking for, an intrinsically interdisciplinary, broadly applicable philosophizing carried out by a premier scientist. Second, Polanyi's account of knowing gave me the mechanism for how knowing works, the very thing I needed to meld with a presuppositional theological approach to overcome the arbitrariness I was feeling. Third, and most importantly, Polanyi repeatedly uttered a claim which was the first thing to address my heartfelt question about reality. That phrase was the water of life to me in a parched desert, It also became the topic of my dissertation, now published as my 4th book. Polanyi, the scientific discoverer, said this: at the moment of discovery, you know you have made contact with reality because you experience a sense of indeterminate future manifestations. I'll say it again. You experience, it's an unspecifiable sense of indeterminate, I mean, you can't say what they are, future manifestations. And I called that the IFM effect. The sense is unspecifiable. The future prospects are inarticulable. This is more the tissue of hope. Yet it was the assurance which I, the baby skeptic, desperately needed. Plus, it was excitement itself, exuberant excess, like Christmas morning. I completed the PhD when I was pregnant with my second of 3 children. I shelved the dissertation and my brain turned to mush. But I was seeing how Polanyi's account of knowing translated well into ordinary life. Now I'm going to tell you that all knowing is subsidiary focal integration. And you get 1 paragraph on this. But I want to say this is how you're already going about knowing. You can't help it. So here it goes. All knowing is subsidiary focal integration. It has a 2-level structure: subsidiary, focal, attending from, attending to, clues, pattern, part, whole. The distal, that means farther away, focal pattern is integrative, a logical leap, irreducible to its subsidiary parts. The proximal, near you, clues are such that you indwell them rather than articulate them. They are called subsidiaries because really you know them and make sense of them only as they bear subsidiarily on the focal pattern. Bike riding, or driving a car, or learning to read, or any skill displays that this is how knowing works, whether we realize it or not. To watch Steelers football, Josh, is also to watch subsidiary focal integration. As for my questions, I still felt clueless. On rare occasions when I could think, I would reread Frame and reread Polanyi and ask, is this true? I couldn't say, but I could say that they were each responsible accounts of knowing. I would, quote, hook my dinghy to their cruise ships to navigate the channel, as I imagined it. And I did so for a couple of decades. Chapter 3, Reality Contacts Back. The turning point came in the year 2000. At 47, I was given a first chance to teach this at Covenant Seminary in a course co-prof Dr. Mike Williams agreed to my calling Covenant Epistemology. First, I was utterly surprised to find that despite the passage of time, young people struggled with the same quirky epistemic questions. My old work was so not out of date. Second, I found that I had indeed navigated the channel and at the other end had come both to affirm and to meld Frame and Polanyi. I actually believed something about knowing and I had something to say. I had the students read these texts and I watched them plunge in with energy and hope. Oh, they said, and can you please write this in a book? Miraculously, the opportunity materialized in a month. Okay, I can't go that far. Oh yes, there I am, sorry. Longing to Know, the Philosophy of Knowledge for Ordinary People was birthed in June 2003. It's a book for people considering Christianity who have questions about knowing. It was me endeavoring to justify my own Christianity to myself, question number 1, as well as to philosophize in a manner accessible by ordinary people, I being an ordinary person. I tapped Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration to show how knowing works and how it works the same for knowing God. In the book, I described contact with reality as more a matter of unlocking and engaging the world. In the "oh, I see it" moment of insight, we experience both recognition and surprise. Contact is such that reality doesn't so much answer our questions as explode them. We find ourselves the ones being interrogated. Now that's contact with reality. When Jesus says to Thomas, "Put your fingers in my wounds," Thomas doesn't say, "Got that right, check." No, he falls on his face and cries, "My Lord and my God." A lively reality contacts back. Chapter 4, interpersonal covenantal contact. Already implicit in that book was the next one, Loving to Know, introducing covenant epistemology. But since the first one surprised me utterly by getting me hired as an academic, it took several years to birth the second one. In it, I propose that, quote, knowing is an unfolding, covenantally constituted, perichoretically, that means dance-like, rhythmical, mutually transformative, interpersonal relationship with a personal real. Covenant epistemology includes subsidiary focal integration as key, but then it augments it to the interpersoned. The reason we need epistemological therapy, Loving to Know argues, is that we have all inherited what I call a defective epistemic default. In response, the book both develops and defends covenant epistemology, and I hope brings healing about. I argue that we do not know in order to love, we love in order to know. The CE thesis had grown naturally out of Polanyi's contact with reality and the fact that reality contacts back. This phenomenon seemed person-like. And in a Christian vision, there is every reason why reality should be person-like. Reality is, and here's my profound street lingo philosophical definition of reality, reality is God and God's stuff. The idea of personhood seemed eminently tappable philosophically, so I did. The argument in Loving to Know includes my first attempts to reflect on the nature of reality. Wherein is reality person-like and why? I developed what I call covenant ontology, growing out of the Lord's repeated "let there be," covenantal, therein personal language that brings reality to be. A few years later, my little manual for knowing offered a slim, cream off the top version of covenant epistemology. It is a how-to for knowing ventures in any field. And I should say, I think knowing works this way in any field. So that's part of my agenda too. Sometime later, I was reading Little Manual and I was shocked to see that I had written, without even thinking about it, that we must trust reality. Trust reality? Had I really said that? I realized that I had, at that moment, without thinking about it, moved beyond my skepticism. Chapter 5, Contact with Reality. In 2017, finally, I published that old dissertation, Contact with Reality, revised, updated, and reframed to reflect my personal journey from baby skeptic to what I now call exuberant realism. Epistemic realism designates a philosophical inquiry regarding whether in our knowing we access a world independent of our thought of it or not. The realist position answers in the affirmative. The negative position, that the world is instead in some way mind-dependent is anti-realist. In modernism, anti-realism continues to have the upper hand. In my book, I argue that Polanyi's distinctive realism is superior to other alternatives. In finishing the book, actually in the moment of writing the last word of the draft, I felt the monkey fall off my back. I had followed through to produce a cycle of books to respond to my 8th grade questions. I was finally ready to begin whatever. I made the last word of the book beginning. And now comes the best part. It's as if I had been inviting the real and reality came, just as covenant epistemology commends and promises. In 2014, as I completed the little manual, God brought to my attention the work of classical Christian metaphysician D.C. Schindler. I read my first Schindler essay, wondrously titled, Surprised by Truth. I was rocked to the core by the uncanny resonances between his work and my own. Lest that sound patronizing, let me add that I felt as if I had taken the test, gotten an A, and now someone was giving me the textbook. I had the IFM sense that his metaphysics would open reality to me, literally. And I sensed my timely readiness for this novitiate. The last chapter of the book, Contact with Reality, was my first attempt at engaging Schindler's work. I have continued to study it and that of related thinkers, teach it and grow. I am proud now to have this young man as my friend, and my splashing around in reality has merged with my love of God. So chapter 6, Reality Contacts. First, this penultimate tiny chapter concerns beauty, though I'll say a little more about beauty presently. From Schindler, I first learned to define beauty as the manifestation of reality. Reality actually self-discloses, and that's what beauty is. When it comes to contact with reality, it turns out that reality in some way was contacting not back, but first. Before our loving in order to know, reality inaugurates our knowing venture and actually attunes us to respond in love. The primacy of the real was implicit in my work, but now it is explicit too. Reality makes the first move. So chapter 7, Contact as Communion. How you doing? Are you awake? Don't answer that question. Oh, I just totally lost my place. So talk amongst yourself till I find chapter 6. 5, 6, 7, there we go. Finally, to the most recent and current chapter of my unfolding quest. Here, I lay my thinking alongside D.C. Schindler's expert work in classical Christian metaphysics for my own and I hope for your edification. Specifically, I consider a chapter in his Love and the Postmodern Predicament, Rediscovering the Real in Beauty, Goodness, and Truth. The chapter is called Knowledge as Personal Presence, and it began life as a lecture at Geneva College, so I was in the audience. The chapter expresses concern about modernity as an age of lonely-mindedness, the isolated self. It's really funny to reread this chapter in COVID-19. Schindler poses that the problem is at root epistemic. We have a distorted view of the knowing self that perpetrated this isolation, and he lays the blame at the feet of René Descartes in the 1600s. He prescribes a return to a classical understanding of knowing and reality. This alone will renew humanity, reality, and culture. Covenant epistemology shares this diagnosis and agenda, but due to my having only superficial training in a classical understanding of anything, it has been glaringly absent in my work. What I am comparing here is CE, covenant epistemology, and CCE, classical Christian epistemology. To argue his thesis, Schindler first offers an account of knowledge as information. Information's defining attribute is, Schindler avers, transferability. It is meant to be an impoverishment of our meaningful relatedness to things to this end, in other words, the end of transferability, and to the end of usability. It presumes distance. David likens it to processed food, far removed from the real broccoli. Of course, our sense of reality suffers. Also, our own identities become fragile and tenuous. Ironically, information gives us power. At the same time, we lose reality. We lose any confidence in reality. All this is characterized by separation of two sorts, between things and information, and actually also between information and ourselves. The modernist epistemic rendering of sense perception as head data trapped us inside our own heads. The postmodernist, as David uses the term, dismisses even the head, the self. We even come to the point in our time of some people affirming as a good thing that we are our information, and in that form, we may live on beyond our bodies. Elsewhere, Schindler concurs that this modernist epistemic is something we feel in our bodies and in our most fundamental presentient orientation to reality. Schindler's description of knowing in modernity nails my 8th grade problem, which my work endeavors to address and heal. Schindler launches into his creatively classical solution. Truth as a transcendental is a property of being by definition. Truth is the intrinsic intelligibility of a thing, meaning that we can understand it. It is the thing's very existence, identity, and essence. That it is and what it is. This is the thing's form. A thing's form is, further, the whole which gathers up its parts and sets them in proper relation to one another. It is the integrating reference point. This whole is an irreducible unity. I'm especially intrigued by this claim that he writes, form, in a word, is the intimate reality of a thing. Intimate. Form is the thing itself. It is this form, this whole of a thing, which modernity summarily dismissed as occult and unnecessary, because it adds nothing to the enumeration of its parts. To this, Schindler responds, we answer, what is added is the presence of the whole as such, which may not seem to matter if we are interested only in the useful information that can be extracted, but it matters a great deal if we wish to retain knowledge of reality. It matters if reality matters. And you so don't hear David's voice and mine because he's, just maybe not so over the top as I am. As a child, I would have been entirely skeptical of Schindler's talk about things and their forms and their intimate reality. That would have seemed the very thing that I was cut off from by the ideas in my mind, the outer things that I could not prove were there. As a child of modernity, it seemed glaringly obvious that we could only explore our mental knowings and never reality itself. That is why most of my life work has been epistemology. My dissertation on epistemic realism was as far as one could go in talking about reality only within the question of knowing. That is why it has taken 6 decades of living to be ready to hear this. Further, I also confess that before I began my Schindler novitiate, as I call it, although I taught philosophy classes about forms, I misconceived them as mere generalities, not as a thing's unique identity. On the other hand, my by now solid grasp of Polanyi's account of knowing as subsidiary focal integration, I believe, had therapeutically reformed me and my students in a posture of openness toward being or reality. It had readied me for metaphysics. For Schindler, of course, metaphysics appropriately precedes epistemology, being before knowing, because the thing's form is both its identity and its intelligibility. In our understanding it, its form is what we know. Knowing is first receptive rather than active. Knowing is, for the classical Christian tradition, a matter of bringing one's mind into conformity, identity with the very being of the thing. The act of knowing is an ecstatic, moving beyond ourselves, intimate encounter with reality. And that's all Schindlerian lingo. To come to know is well beyond information. It is entry into reality itself and receiving reality within us. We penetrate, we join, we become. Schindler notes that this way of understanding knowing is evident in Plato, knowing as presence, communion, erotic encounter. The mind, then, Schindler emphasizes, is precisely not an impediment to this encounter and communion, but rather the privileged place of it. Concepts, as Aquinas said, are not what we know, but that by which we know. Think subsidiary here. And in knowing, reality becomes present, quote, in person, so to speak, unquote. Schindler writes, if truth is a property of being, our knowing takes the form of a conformity to reality. To know in this sense is to make genuine contact with things, to take into ourselves the reality in which we have always already been involved in beauty and goodness. It thus entails an aspiration beyond episodic contact to a more constant fidelity, a kind of belonging to the real, or a habitual devotion, not involving not just our minds, but the whole of our lives. Such a deep conformity is what the classical tradition meant by the term wisdom. And it is just that has fallen to the margins in our modernist reconception of truth. A lot of footnotes there. And he concludes, and I've got this all in italics. Our proposal is that recovering the classical sense of intimate personal presence as a paradigm of knowledge would contribute in a fundamental way to the renewal of our humanity and our sense of reality in the face of the onslaught of cultural forces that threaten to eclipse. And I just love his next comment about information. And I'm adding the sarcasm. I don't think he would stoop to it. Recovering this paradigm, it should be noted, does not require the complete elimination of information and the evident benefits it can bring, but only a serious relativizing of its significance. Instead of thinking of information as the paradigm of knowledge, we ought to see it as a relatively adequate substitute for knowledge, which may be necessary or useful in particular circumstances when knowledge is not possible. Information is what you can settle for in the as yet absence of knowledge. Information is, to switch to a Polanyian account, disparate, focal particulars which as yet are mis or half understood. To idolize information is to blind oneself to reality. No wonder we distrust the presence of the real. We can helpfully connect Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration with Schindler's classical account. Schindler himself cites Polanyi in this text. Knowing is paradigmatically a quest for a logical leap to an irreducible pattern, a whole which transforms clues and imbues parts with their meaning. In some way, the pattern logically precedes and exceeds the particulars turned clues turned subsidiaries, which prompted it. Of course, Polanyi is talking knowing, insight at this point, and Schindler is talking being, things. But Polanyi himself attends extensively to the correlation between knowing and being. My comparison reveals that Polanyi's innovative account of knowing, in defying modernist epistemology, also challenges its latent metaphysic. Polanyi was reinstalling the very orientation to knowing and being that Schindler blames modernity for erasing. Polanyi, the great scientist, understood that one cannot be a great scientific discoverer without implicitly practicing this epistemic and this metaphysic. This is why Polanyian epistemology proves therapeutic for both knowing and reality. Its implicit metaphysical orientation accords with that of classical Christian metaphysics. I have been moving toward this as my covenant epistemology augments Polanyian epistemology to a relational, interpersonal epistemology, which therein requires a person-like understanding of reality. David's phrases describing knowing as personal presence accord profoundly with what I was able to say in 2011 in Loving to Know. I was already speaking of knowing as communion with the real, which I might not have said as the chapter title for chapter 7. As I said, now that I've written the test, I am studying the text. The fact that Schindler's expert metaphysical work is corroborating covenant epistemology also enriches it and me deeply. It's a contrast between sticking a toe in the water's edge and launching myself into the breakers. I am finally giving myself to the communion that I hoped for, to trust David's presumed, quote, in which we have always already been involved with respect to the real. However, Polanyi's and Schindler's account display a difference in viewpoint. Polanyi was a discoverer. He was therefore preoccupied with the not yet known and how we move toward it. There is much risk and responsibility and fallibility in our striving to understand. He attends to knowing on the near side of the integrative pattern. At one point, he says that the paradigmatic case of knowing is knowledge of and approaching discovery. By contrast, Schindler's classical Christian metaphysics attends to the thing as it is already known by us. Communion is a state of joyous, wondrous, restful attainment of ongoing oneness with the thing. In the rearview mirror is the angst of our beginning efforts and proposal. Whereas Polanyi emphasizes the moment of insight, Schindler is in love with the fundamental question, what is it? However, the two accounts in fact agree on both viewpoints. Polanyian epistemology affirms the logical priority of the irreducible integrative pattern. Schindler in other texts demonstrates that on a classical account, the thing is given its own desire to grow to itself. And he shows how this makes sense uniquely in the Christian completion of the classical tradition. It is God who, as uncontainably goodness himself, excessively, generously overflows to give things even to themselves, and to desire him. But this difference of viewpoint is just why Polanyi's work uniquely gave me what I so desperately needed, hope of the real. Given my woebegone stance of skepticism, I was in no place to receive metaphysical ministrations. That I am now is proof of my maturation. It also underscores the providential kindness of the Lord in my quest for reality. So now finally a coda concerning beauty, and then my conclusion. Almost done. Finally, as a coda, kind of coda, let me say a little more about how beauty is intersecting my developing understanding. In the last year, I have been invited to think more about beauty for 2 church conferences. To prepare, I delved into classical Christian metaphysics, specifically pertaining to the Christian doctrine of creation. I tackled the book, No God, No Science, Theology, Cosmology, Biology, written by David Schindler's friend and colleague, Michael Hanby. I came away with a fuller account of things and the realization that a positive account of things is the unique philosophical contribution of Christianity. A pre-Christian Greek philosophy anticipates but lacks a positive account of particularity, meaning particular things. A modern scientistic philosophy actually rejects particularity of things to the end of human mastery and control. Christians of all people, surprise, are those who can say, I love things. Now, David's chapter 2 in Love and the Postmodern Predicament is his account of beauty. He has followed in theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar's ordering of the transcendentals, affirming that, quote, beauty shall be our first word, goodness next, and finally truth. Schindler defines beauty as the manifestation of reality, as I noted. In my street philosophy lingo, reality shows up and says, here I am. The epiphanic event of a thing's doing that is what beauty is. So now in my street philosophy lingo, I define beauty as real things that pop. And by pop, I mean what we mean when we might say something like this. If you put red shoes in a purse with that gray suit, it will really pop. That moment of pop is a moment when reality opens its fan of feathers like a peacock for our notice, and we go, oh. In that moment, we lose our hearts to the thing and promise to follow where it leads. That's the covenantal part. And we are off on the journey of loving to know. As I said before, little manual could use a new first chapter. Beauty begins the knowing event. This is because reality begins the knowing event. Reality contacts first. Polanyi, the discoverer and epistemologist, averred that a sense of beauty attends the moment of discovery, affirming it. Plus, I think it is obvious that any integrative pattern is therein a thing of beauty. To reference a standard understanding of beauty, and Balthasar and Schindler's too, beauty is the splendor of the form, the inexhaustive excess and bottomless depths of the thing. It is fittingly gratuitous and gratuitously fitting. I have those terms from Natalie Karn at Baylor University. This describes also an integrative pattern, and there is little difference in this lingo from the fundamental definition of a thing, according to Schindler and Hanby. But I think that you can also see that this understanding makes my heart sing especially. I'm the girl who was tantalized by inexhaustive, indeterminate future manifestations as the signature of contact with reality. Beauty and IFMs are of a piece. And now my conclusion. To conclude, What may we take away from this story of my quirky, lifelong quest for reality? It has acquainted you afresh with matters of knowing and being that must be understood, even to identify the problematic nature of our modernity, its widespread, strident, defective epistemic default, and its defective metaphysical default also. We must identify its adverse impact on all aspects of our life, work, and culture, even on our Christian spirituality. In my story, you have heard covenant epistemology's proposals and can see how knowing actually already works this way. And I trust that this story has brought you a greater ingress of healing with respect to modernity. For as I said at the beginning, everyone in modernity is or should be on a quest for reality. My hope is for everyone to be restored to communion with the real. What is more, to be human is to be a created being, and that is to be intrinsically a tissue of desire. To be human is to be a quest for reality. To be human is to long to know, to long to be, to long for communion with the real, to desire God. So this talk, I pray, offers you encouragement in your fundamental orientation to the world. According to Schindler, Balthasar speaks of the soul's fundamental orientation to the world as one of affirmation and joy in being. Modernity has thwarted our fundamental openness to the heart of things, replacing desire with indifference and suspicion, replacing consent with acedia. We now see the way open to return home. Thank you for entering into my story.
Yeah. Everyone's clapping at home, Esther.
Thank you. Virtual clapping.
Virtually clapping. In fact, wait, I can actually do that, I think. Oh, I can't do that.
Don't worry about it.
We do have clapping on the okay. So here typically what we'll do at this point in the talk is the people who were present among us, I would give them 6 minutes to shake hands with somebody around them, introduce themselves, and have a bit of a conversation about what would they just heard. So this is the intention, is to be a communal thing. So I'm actually going to do that. So wherever you are socially distancing at this moment, take a minute and talk with somebody in the very room, or go get a drink, or go whatever you got to do for 5 minutes, and take a couple minutes. We're going to start culling our questions. We've got some good ones. If you there's still time if you want to get your questions in, but take a couple of minutes and talk about it, and we'll be right back. Give us your questions. Let's looking at some of these questions real quick. We've got some good ones. I've been getting texts left and right.
How many people do you think are out there? I see 32 participants showing here. And you say there's some on Facebook.
There's some here, there, and yon. I think there's probably 2,000. No, that's not true. I don't know, probably 100 plus-ish.
Nice, that's wonderful.
Okay, so I'm not actually going to give people 5 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Here's one to kick us off. Are you ready, Esther?
I'm ready.
Okay. This comes from one of our dads here at the school. Is your understanding of the search for reality a search for holiness?
Sure. because I would think that, and it takes some kind of metaphysical thinking to think of being or reality as characterized by the transcendentals. So God and his stuff as beautiful, true, and good. And so longing to know is longing for the good and the beautiful as well as the true, I would say. So, and I would think that maybe holiness would accord more easily with this holistic covenant epistemological paradigm than it would with the knowledge as information paradigm, which would just have information as the paradigm, obviously, but then it would be another question whether what you did with that, and that could be for good or for ill. And it also, part of the defective epistemic default is that you've got this divorce between things related to knowledge and things related to morals or religion or faith, all of those. And so holiness would be kind of a marginalized member of the order pair, and it would be separated and divorced from knowledge. So I would say holiness is way more integrated with orientation to reality, a la covenant epistemology, than on the predominant paradigm in modernity.
Good. On something of a similar note, you seem to make this an explicitly theistic epistemology. Must epistemology be so theistically construed?
I was really trying to come up with an understanding of how knowing works for everybody. And I think knowing works this way, whether you know God or not. And as such, I think that when you see that knowing works this way, it actually bears a quiet witness to the reality of God. And I think people realize that. For one thing, they talk about epiphany, you know, the moment of epiphany, or the idea of inspiration. And out and out pagans just get really excited and in a sense of wonder with regard to things that have been revealed to them, and they might even call it a revelation. So I think the Lord bears witness to himself in the fundamental structure of knowing for all humans. So did I have to make it this theistic? I did because I could. I did because if you happen to, I didn't want to come up with an epistemology that illicitly, presumptively was theological at the outset by presuming that God didn't exist. That's just as theological. And so, and I found that the motifs that I was attuned to in a Christian vision made more sense of knowing, just like the interpersoned one. Do you know that Christianity actually invented the concept of personhood? It wasn't in the Greek, it wasn't in Greek philosophy. We came to the idea of personhood in connection with hammering out how Jesus was a human and God at the same time, and how the Trinity are three persons with one nature. So it was in that context in the 300s and 400s that we came up with the idea of personhood. So lots of us use the idea of personhood and find it very rich, as we should, but it's theistically loaded, and Christian theistically at that. So I don't know, I'm just talking around this here, but hopefully that helps.
No, it's good. Here's a question from one of our sophomores, actually. Going back to subsidiary focal integration, is there anything at all that can't be known through SFI? You offer lots of examples, and you have throughout your time with us. Is there anything at all that you could think of to which SFI does not apply?
Well, I would like to say my approach has been to argue for what the paradigm of knowing is, and as covenant epistemology. And I would suggest or commend that maybe the question is not, is there anything that doesn't fit, but how can you see it as widely as possible? In other words, maybe we could turn the approach around to a more positive one. How many things can you name that it does pertain to? And I would suggest to you that if you understand subsidiary focal integration, you'll spend the rest of your life finding examples. And if you find one that it doesn't pertain to, let me know. So actually, this is actually really kind of fun and puzzling to think about. So the presumption that subsidiary focal integration rejects is the presumption that all knowledge is explicit and articulate. That means both of those mean we can say them in words. So if you make something explicit or if you articulate it, you put it in words. Okay. So you might think that an example of knowledge that isn't subsidiary focal integration would be explicit knowledge. But then think about this. What would be an example of explicit knowledge? First of all, let me say a sentence that's true. Here in Western PA, it's raining outside and it's miserable. Now, I'm presuming you understood that sentence. Well, understanding is subsidiary focal integration. The only way that sentence would make any sense to you is if you were if it was subsidiary to your understanding, which makes me wonder if it's even possible to have an explicit claim, because an explicit claim by definition would be meaningless. And I have said a whole pile of things all over you tonight, you know, big words, big sentences, I read for almost an hour. And even if you half understood it, and even if you didn't understand it and you were struggling to understand it, what you were struggling to do was to climb in subsidiarily to what I was saying to try to put it together in a pattern. And that's subsidiary focal integration. So I don't even know that we could turn around without subsidiary focal integration.
Similarly, just a little follow-up to that. If someone wanted to learn more about subsidiary focal integration, give us maybe 2 places to start. Give us baby steps to subsidiary focal integration.
Well, I'd like to recommend Longing to Know to you because, and it's the place where I start my students. Yes, it's a book for people considering Christianity who have questions about knowing, but it is the best that I know of introduction to subsidiary focal integration. And so chapter 6 is called the Oh, I See It moment, and it's all kind of in there. And then chapters after that are, and all the because I'm trying to make this an accessible book to busy people, all the chapters are under 5 pages long. And every chapter after that takes a little piece of subsidiary focal integration and explains it. And the way the book is laid out, I'm arguing that yes, we can know God, but we need to know how knowing works. And the way knowing works is the same for knowing your auto mechanic as it is for knowing God. So the thriving premise of the book is that knowing God is like knowing my auto mechanic. So in every one of these little chapters, I do a little piece of subsidiary focal integration. I apply it to knowing my auto mechanic, Jeff Dare, and then I apply it to knowing God. So that's not why I read it with my students. Why I read it is to help them get on board with subsidiary focal integration. And then if I can also say related to that, the best thing to do when you're reading that is pick a skill of your own that you're really good at, like driving a car, riding a bike, shooting baskets, crocheting, right? Something obvious, playing guitar. And then as you read it, see if you can take the words and put it on the skill that you're doing. And that's the way it seems to be to teach it. I gave you one measly little paragraph in this big quest for reality on subsidiary focal integration, but it would be lovely to have y'all in a room and make you do things and then report to me on what you were doing. And by the end of it, you would be tracking just fine.
Perfect. Here's a question from one of our juniors. This goes back to the beauty stuff. Don't we all see beauty differently? I mean, like, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. If that's the case, then how could we possibly have that as a starting point for knowing? Wouldn't we all end up therefore being somewhat relativistic in our knowing ventures? If the place we start is relativistic, how do we not end up with a relativistic end?
Well, I want to tell you, it's the lie of modernism that beauty is subjective. And you can thank David Hume for that in the British tradition, okay? And that is how modernism marginalized beauty, by making it a matter of subjective taste. And we all buy it hook, line, and sinker. And we just presume that everybody has their own private understanding of beauty. That's the addition of us 20th and 21st century people. that your idea of beauty would be different from mine. Having said that, it is true that your eye is involved in beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The trick is, it's not only in the eye of the beholder, because what there needs to be is an encounter. And it could well be that you see a beauty that is there that I am not equipped to see, which means, please acquaint me so I'll see it. Right? So yes, it's dynamic. Yes, it involves you. Yes, it involves you in your uniqueness, but it is not merely that. Okay? And if it were merely that, it just would, it doesn't even deserve the name beauty, I don't think. You know? So that's maybe a beginning answer to that. You know, beauty is, it does matter how you see, because quite honestly, okay, so I work a little bit with Makoto Fujimura. He's an artist. He sees stuff I don't see, right? I read Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She sees stuff that I don't see. But what I feel is they teach me to see. And it's not because they've got some private subjective taste. They're helping me to see what's there. They're helping me to see what's there. When I actually, back to Annie Dillard, so I love Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And when I found out I was moving to Pittsburgh, I figured the best thing I could do to get ready to move to Pittsburgh was to read her book, American Childhood, because she grew up in Pittsburgh. And I figured I'd like someone of Annie Dillard's incredible writerly vision to help me see Pittsburgh. And that was a great decision. And after I'd been here for a few years, I reread it, having come to know all the places she was talking about. And so I looked to her as an authority of vision to help me see what is there. And then the other thing that's at play here is, in our defective metaphysical default in modernity, what we have done is reduce modernity to two-dimensional is or isn't, ones or zeros. And we have got to recover, because it's true, that reality is characterized by bottomless depths. Okay? There is no end to the mystery of reality. It's just like a person. If you know the person, you know the mystery, but it doesn't evacuate the person or the reality of mystery. There are bottomless depths. Annie Dillard says this: nature is a fan dancer, And she never, ever drops the last fan. And so the quest for reality is endless. And that is not frustration, that is joy. That is exuberant joy. And it takes us through eternity.
That's really good. This is from our Midtown, the glue of the Midtown campus, our office manager. She wants to know who to blame for all of our epistemological ills. Did the fall hurt our ability to make contact with reality, or should we blame Descartes for all of it?
Yeah, oh, that's so good. Thank you. Sure, the fall, like sin skews our understanding of and our everything, right? We know that. But modernity has a particular sin. So I've actually gotten to calling it the sin of modernism. It's, you know, we don't need modernism to sin, but being modernists, we sin. Right?
Mhm.
So we need to confess those sins. And so our version of whatever was going on in the garden, you know, whatever the, you know, we mean in our tradition by the noetic effects of sin, they include modernism, the anti-philosophical philosophy of modernism, modernist epistemology, modernist metaphysics. And if we then have committed the oversight of thinking that philosophy isn't essential, we of all people are ill-equipped to address that sin.
How are you doing, Esther? Are you feeling good? Are you?
Great, I want another glass of water. Would you excuse me and let me go get one?
Go for it.
All right, I'll be back and I'm fine.
Okay, good.
All right.
Keep those questions rolling in. We've got some good ones. Yes. These are good. Let's try to stump Esther. She's had good answers to everything. Is there anything we can ask her that she won't be able to answer? That's what we want to know. We also want to see what she's reading on her bookshelf there. Looks like a really good collection of books. Oh, hey everybody. It switched to me. Now I'm on. Oh, good. Esther's back and we can stop looking at me now. Nobody wants to look at me. Esther, they want to see you. Do you want to take, let's take maybe 3 more questions. Does that sound good to you? Do you want to take a technical one and we'll work our way back to less technical?
Whatever you want, it's fine.
All right, here's something of a technical question. I'd like to hear more about why Dr. Meek found Till and Frame to be arbitrary and how you've gotten away from that specific problem that you found in those authors.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's this big word, presuppositionalism, which when I came to understand it seemed obvious to me. And that's actually kind of why I'm in philosophy, because it just seemed to me that when you're looking at an argument, what's going on in an argument, I mean like premises and conclusion, is just not the main act. The main act is something more deeper, which would be like fundamental presuppositions that are prior to the actual argumentation that happens. And so fundamental belief commitments really are more the main act. And then it seemed to me that a theology is something that you would accept that was shaped by fundamental commitments. And it seemed to me that anything else was too. So let's say you're a committed atheist or a committed Hindu or Islamist or something like that. Those are shaped by fundamental belief commitments too. So that felt arbitrary to me. And the other thing is when we were in the process of identifying the commitments and I was looking at them, I'd think to myself, well, that doesn't exactly feel like why I'm a Christian. And so that felt arbitrary too. And I couldn't see how that you could like prove that this set was better than that set. So that seemed arbitrary to me too. So when I say that Polanyi showed me how it works, this is in a little book of 3 lectures called The Tacit Dimension. And there's a paragraph in there where he just says theoretical frameworks are like tools. Okay. And that means that what you're supposed to do with them is not observe them, but indwell them. So a hammer is not a hammer if you're looking at it and like taking measurements on the hammer. It's only a hammer when you pick it up and start, whacking, right? So similarly, of course, examining and looking at presuppositions would feel arbitrary because it's focusing on what you ought to be subsidiarily indwelling. Okay. So that's the switch from focal to subsidiary. And that showed me how what you're supposed to do with a theoretical framework, like covenant theology or whatever theology approach that you take, or like the authoritative word, what you're supposed to do with it is indwell it, right? And then it's as you indwell it, it becomes part of you and it also roots you in the world, okay? So just like once you learn to ride a bike, that like roots you in the world, roots you in your body, and it roots you in the world. The world opens up to you in bike trail possibilities. It just roots you in the world. So that seemed to me to explain why the whole thing had felt arbitrary to me. And it's because I was supposed to subsidiarily indwell it rather than focus on it. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
It's good. Why, this comes from one of our professors at the school, why aren't more people bothered by these questions like you and eighth grade versions of her?
Well, that professor might have a better answer to it than I do. So I'd be really interested in hearing that. I have to say, because it's because of the modernist override. And the modernist override tells us that philosophy and philosophical matters are not useful. And they're not for everybody. And they're abstract and difficult. And yeah, but the main thing is they're not useful. They're not practical, right? And so we have not even been allowed to think about philosophical things. And I would like to suggest that what happens, and I'm sure this isn't the case at your school, but in lots of schools, when kids start to grow up and and some of them at least have philosophical preoccupations, there is a place in high school where those kinds of things get explored, and that's liable to be the literature and drama department. Okay, so I think a lot of people turn to literature, right, because it's the place where they can stand a prayer of a chance of dealing with questions that seem to be somehow real, only they're also feeling like they're weird because they've got those questions. So I really think that in modernity, as long as anybody's trying to be philosophical, they're going to be fighting upstream. They're going to be fighting upstream. Now, I don't know how you feel about this, but I do think it's helpful to see that this is an override, because I think there are these times in our lives that philosophical questions come to the fore. They often are in the face of death, right? Or some other crisis. Or they might be just in an exquisite experience of beauty, like music or something like that. Why I had 8th grade questions, I bet somebody in the audience out there is saying, because she's an Enneagram 4. Okay, and that could be part of what was going on. But it also turned out that my story is the story of maternity too. And then the other thing is, think of us as image bearers. You know, if you believe in, you know, the Bible's idea that humans are made in the image of God, there's a rightness and a goodness and a reality check that is kind of something that will come out. Okay. And I would like to say that even though we self-describe mistakenly about knowledge, we might say that what we're doing is following the scientific method, for example. What we're actually doing is not what we describe ourselves as doing. And where we're doing knowing well, it's subsidiary focal integration and covenant epistemology. And all you need to do is look at a great carpenter at work, an auto mechanic, a volleyball player, da-da-da. I mean, again, back to Steelers football. You know, that is it's a beautiful thing. And so where you see that happening, it would be impossible to describe that as knowledge as information, yet we're liable to revert to that because it's all we think we are doing.
Good. Okay, I think we have about 2 more questions. You've been so great, Esther. Let's do 2 more. How important has it been for you to be able to talk about these ideas with other people? How important has community been to you as you flesh out these thoughts and these ideas? How does community play into all of this that you're talking about?
Okay, so I'm not sure which of 2 questions you're asking. Have I fleshed out these ideas in community with others? I would say, if you look, for example, at Loving to Know, but actually all of my books and actually all of my talk right now, I kept thinking this as I was reading it to you. I'm spending all this time talking about other people. Which also might be a 4th thing too. You know, I have spent years listening to Michael Polanyi, and I've spent years listening to John Frame, and years listening to, and if you look in Loving to Know, it's every chapter is called a conversation, and it's a conversation with this or that different persons, for John McMurray and Martin Buber and James Loder and Colin Gunton and what's his name, David Schnark and Phil Rolnick, and I would say that's the community in which I have. What I've been trying to do, I think, is actually subsidiary focal integration. What I've tried to do is put these things together in a coherent pattern. And in a way that, you know, it's not additive, but I say this at the beginning of Loving to Know, I'm asking you, do you see what I see? You know, here I'm going to lay out these conversations and I'm asking you, do you see the pattern? So that I would say is my community. I haven't had that many people to talk with orally about that, except I have an absolutely fantastic best in the world philosophy colleague and friend, Bob Fraser, who just understands me deeply. You know? So that's really good. But then the other sort of question I wondered if what you were asking was how covenant epistemology plays out communally. And I would say the knowing venture can just as easily be a community adventure. So like, do you remember Apollo 13? Oh, or just take the COVID virus, everybody is scrambling together to try to figure things out, okay? So that is very much a communal coming to know. Okay, I think an institution like the academy, you are struggling together to figure out some things. And that's a communal act of coming to know. I think the best example of it, maybe I'm just prejudiced, but I just love jazz. And I think jazz ensemble is coming to know communally, right? And what's more, this improvisational sort of a thing is just, it's over the top. And it's no surprise to me that those people live to be as old as they do. Because I think what they're doing is part of this communal dance of the unfolding of reality.
Okay, so one last question. Oh, but before we go, my sophomore just walked through, and I just want all the sophomores who are listening to know, I made a very similar point about hammer. I used a different example, but a hammer's not a hammer if you're staring at it. It's a hammer when you use it. And they lost their minds. So I just want I want every one of them.
Good or bad?
They thought I was crazy town. So I just want all of them to know that Esther backs me up here.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my sophomore right now. Esther backs me up. I win. Okay, here's where I want us to end. We'll end on this question. Because I think this would be a really fun way to see how this been lived out by other people.
I'm sorry, I have to pause just a minute. Let me say another part of who's in my community, and that's my students. Okay. So I just had to say that too. Sorry.
No. I think it really matters that's part of it. All right, last question. Tell us your favorite story, because I'm sure people write you all the time. Your favorite story of how your work has changed somebody.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cry. Well, I can't say people write me all the time, but I have had multiple letters or comments that say, this has changed my life. And I was a goner, and this kind of changed my life. And it's amazing to read one of those, let alone the ones I've been blessed to read. So that happens a lot.
Thank you for that. Yes. I think that answer alone shows how important what you're doing is mattering to people. Thank you, Esther Meek. This was amazing. Thank you so very much. There is so much to think about, so much more to be talking about with each other in the communities you're talking about. My students now know that I'm right. This has been so great.
And humble.
So thank you so much for joining us, Esther. Let me say a couple of more thank yous. We have lots of people to thank for this. Of course, first and foremost, Esther, thank you so much. Students who came and listened to Esther, students who have been putting up with me for all these years, talking about Esther and Polanyi and all those. Thank y'all, students. Thank you so much. IT gurus, Eric and Stephen, you guys have been great. Amy, the Q&A guru, the grand announcement on Facebook and social media, Poobah, way to go. Principals and admins, thank you all so much. Zoom, shout out to Zoom. Thank you, Zoom. Thanks to Doug for inviting Esther Meek to this random
Doug.
he had in March 2003 that is culminating in this moment for our school. This started 17 years ago. Thanks for that. Thanks to our previous Lyceum speakers, Carl, Eleanor, Jamie, and Alan. You've blazed a trail for us to continue to use. Thank you for that. And for all of you, I know there's Netflix to stream, there's Hulu to stream, there's all kinds of things you could have been doing tonight.
Mhm.
And you joined us for what I think is a really important talk, and really important, not just information. This is not information. This is an opportunity and an invitation to live embodied in what Esther, by an authoritative guide, showing us how to find the true, the good, and the beautiful, and embody that in our own lives. So again, thank you all. Esther, one more time. I'm going to put Esther back up there. Hang on. We're going to put Esther up so we can thank her one more time. Esther, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
And I wish each one of you would somehow send me your picture so I can see your faces. Because I haven't been able, and that's just sad for me. But anyway, thank you.
But this has been far beyond what I thought we could actually pull off. And so Esther, your generosity and your graciousness, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you, Josh. And thank you all for what you're doing. And may this encourage you to persevere in the good work that you're doing there in OK City. So God bless.
Thanks. Okay. Stephen, are we off?